Robert Hyland Jr. was the son of the St. Louis Cardinals team doctor, so he grew up with a very up-and-close look at baseball, exposed to the legendary Gas House Gang. Thoughts of a career in the game were inevitable. He was a good athlete, played baseball at St. Louis University, but he was not good enough to be a pro. He didn't want medicine, so he eventually turned to broadcasting. He worked in advertising sales and eventually wound up at KMOX as the general sales manager, then assistant general manager, and finally named general manager of KMOX in 1955. He transformed the station into a national powerhouse that still dominates the St. Louis market even 25 years after his death. Under Hyland's watch, KMOX became the sports voice of St. Louis and later the lofty title of the sports voice of America. While that was impressive, his major mark in broadcasting has impacted the radio industry around the world. In 1960, Bob Hyland gave away the music library, all the records, and invented talk radio. When broadcast executives heard that KMOX would be broadcasting something called At Your Service, where listeners could call in and participate in the programs, they said he was crazy. It would never work. But did it work? Bob Hyland created the format that's now a staple in thousands of radio stations around the world. Please watch the monitors for some reflections of Bob Hyland from Bob Costas.
Hi, it's Bob Costas. Sorry I can't be there in St. Louis tonight. I'm at Nationals Park in D.C. doing the Dodgers and the Nationals, although obviously the perceptive among you will detect the fact that this is taped because I'm in Foxborough as I'm doing this for a Patriots game, but that is neither here nor there. One of the people who is there is my longtime friend, Bill McDermott, my friend of more than 40 years, St. Louis's Mr. Soccer, first as a terrific soccer player with the Billikens at St. Louis University, and then as an authority on all things soccer, local, collegiate, national, international, the Olympics, whatever it may be, radio, television, the guy you call upon when you want someone to talk knowledgeably and enthusiastically about soccer is Bill McDermott. I'm so happy for him that he is now a member of the St. Louis Sports Hall of Fame. And I'm especially happy for the Hyland family and Molly Hyland, who is there tonight representing the Hyland family. My connection to that family and their extraordinary legacy in St. Louis broadcasting and sports goes back to 1974, when Robert Hyland, and no one ever called him Bob. In fact, Robert would have been too informal. He was always Mr. Hyland to me. He plucked me out of Syracuse, New York at age 22 and hired me to be the voice of the Spirits of St. Louis of the ABA. The Spirits didn't last either in St. Louis or at KMOX, but somehow I did. Mr. Hyland was my mentor and my patron. He advanced my career at KMOX, and he also championed me to the network executives in New York. Mr. Hyland's credibility was pretty high. After all, he ran the station that had given voice to Harry Carey, to Jack Buck, to Joe Garagiola, to Dan Kelly, to Jay Randolph, and later to Dan Dierdorf, Gary Bender, and Joe Buck, and the list goes on, not to mention non-sports luminaries like Bob Hardy, Jack Carney, and now Charlie Brennan. As many of you recall, under Mr. Hyland, KMOX truly was the voice of St. Louis, and he truly was one of the most influential people in the entire city and region. In addition to his intellect and extraordinary work ethic, his personal presence was powerful and magnetic. I mean, look at this guy. He looks like a golden age of Hollywood movie star, like Central Casting sent in someone to play a judge or a senator. He radiated authority, but beneath it all was compassion and kindness. Still, his standing and his almost obsessive dedication to KMOX could lead to some amusing moments. As some of you may know, he would come into the office at 3 a.m. every day, Monday through Saturday, and then he would go to Mass at the old cathedral across the way at 7 a.m. and then be back at his desk by 8 a.m. On Saturdays, he left at noon, and he took Sundays off. So when I was just starting out there, and very much intimidated by Mr. Hyland, I thought if I was ever going to get an audience with him and really have his undivided attention, the best thing to do would be to walk into his office at about 3:05 in the morning. So I actually went down to KMOX and slept on a sofa in the sports office starting at midnight, had someone wake me up at 3, cleared my bleary eyes, stuck my head in his door, knocked gently and said, Mr. Hyland, could I have a moment? And he looked up from his desk and said, don't bother me now. Can't you see I'm busy? On another occasion, Dan Kelly's flight couldn't get out of Toronto. He was doing NHL games on the network, and he had to come back for a Saturday night game with the Blues, and he couldn't get there in time. So the phone rings at my apartment in St. Louis, and Mr. Hyland says, it's like 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Bob, I need you to do the Blues-Red Wings game tonight. I said, Mr. Hyland, you know I'd do anything you ask, anytime, but I have tickets for the Rolling Stones tonight at Kiel Auditorium. There was some sputtering on the other end of the line, and then he said, and I quote verbatim, well, all right, young man, but in the future, don't make any more of these social engagements. Of course I won't, Mr. Hyland. What could I possibly have been thinking? My respect for him was enormous, but my enduring gratitude is even greater. These days, as the fates would have it, I work the Kentucky Derby with Mr. Hyland's grandson, Rob, who's one of the best producers in all of sports television. And Rob's dad, known to everyone as Rip, ran CBS Radio's entire portfolio of FM stations as well as a television station in Los Angeles. And going way, way back, Rob's great-grandfather, Dr. Robert Hyland, the first Robert Hyland, at least that I know of, was known far and wide as the Surgeon General of baseball, as he served as the team doctor for both the Cardinals and the late lamented St. Louis Browns. Considering that the Cardinals and much of St. Louis sports are synonymous with KMOX, and considering the Hyland family's St. Louis roots and its multi-generational connections to baseball and broadcasting, it's completely fitting that Bob Hyland, may I call you Bob? Thank you. That Bob Hyland and the Hyland family would be recognized by the St. Louis Sports Hall of Fame. Congratulations.
Bob Costas could do 15 minutes on the phone book. Let me tell you. That's off the top of his head. That's terrific. Molly Hyland, Robert Hyland's daughter, is here to receive the award tonight. Molly, good to see you.
Thanks, Ron.
Your dad was really something. I want to correct something that Bob said. He said that Mr. Hyland came in at 3 in the morning. In those days, late in his life, I was working afternoons and evenings at KMOX, and I would leave about 11 o'clock. And many nights, I would meet him at the elevator at 11 o'clock at night, and he's coming into work. He's been there. He'd be there all night, all day, leave 4:30. I said to him one time, boss, when do you sleep? He said, 7 to 10 at night, that's all I need. Molly, I don't know how much you saw of him as his daughter.
Well, as a matter of fact, my curfews when I was in college and in high school was whenever Dad left for work. So if Dad had gone before I got home, I was really in trouble.
You were in trouble.
Yeah.
Because in those days it was 11 o'clock. Later on, earlier in his career, it was 3 or 2:30 or 3 in the morning. But he was a man that commanded. I don't know, there was an air about him, and he was a very handsome man. And you walk into his office, and he had this glass-top desk with nothing on it, usually.
Right.
And people that would work there 15, 20 years, they'd go and their knees would be shaking because he had that kind of dominance. But I found him to be very, very fair. If you worked hard for him and did what he asked, he would treat you well, and he treated me very well.
He had very high standards, and he instilled that in all 4 of us kids. And it was really unique to grow up with someone like that, and I feel like I still have a lot of that today.
Yeah, it's even though it's been 25 years.
I
yeah.
know.
And he died far too young of cancer, of course.
Right.
He had cancer twice, as I recall.
Yes.
But he had such a command of the broadcasting industry, and people laughed at him when he said he gave away the music, all the records, and was going to talk to listeners on the phone. They said, "You're out of your mind."
That was really out there. That was such an unusual thing to do, and I think he gave it all the records to a charity,
Yeah.
a veterans home or something like that. And he did that so the on-air announcers wouldn't be tempted to go back to a record when the talk was a little bit delayed.
Yeah, and they created the delay system too at KMOX.
Yes,
The
right.
engineers created that, and they did it with two big reel-to-reel machines. And if people know anything about machines, one was on one side of the room, the other was on the other side, and this ran this tape all the way across the room that delayed things about 7 seconds. And if somebody used a word they shouldn't use on the air, we had a kill button. We could hit that button, and it would go back live. And so sometimes they tried, but rarely got away with it. But he was so innovative, and he was a great judge of talent. Finding a Bob Costas, for example, that's pretty rare.
Yeah, that is really one of the things that I remember him being so innovative and really taking chances on people and wanting to find the best talent and find the best entertainment in what he was doing, whether it was Bob Costas or Jack Carney and Jack Buck, his long relationship with Jack Buck, of course.
Jack Buck was the only guy that called him Bob.
Right.
He's the only one.
Yeah.
I asked Dan Kelly when I worked there, I said, I don't want to call him Mr. Hyland, but I know I can't call him Bob. What do you call him? And he said, I call him boss or chief, and he likes that. So that's what I always did, and it was fine. But he was a great guy, great man, and so influential in broadcasting. You must still be very, very proud.
Absolutely.
Molly Hyland, ladies and gentlemen. The centerpieces, the flower centerpieces, courtesy of Walter Knoll. We wanted to acknowledge them tonight because they're very, very nice, and we thank them for that.
Ron, I got one thing to say. I had a great relationship with Mr. Hyland. He would call my home at 2 or 3 in the morning, 4 in the morning. My wife would say, well, I guess it's Mr. Hyland, because we did the Missouri games. Ron was involved, and
Right.
he'd say, well, I got to fly you guys back from somewhere. Where are you this week? And he'd find a jet for us and take Dan Kelly and Ron and Bill Wilkerson and Bob Starr and me to games. And he was always very generous with me. And if I wanted to see him, the door was open. So I really appreciate him.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's interesting because if I wanted his total undivided attention, I literally would set the alarm clock for 3 in the morning and call him. And it would be, yes, it was like the middle of the day. It's phenomenal. But he was an amazing guy.